Picture this. It's 1957. In a bleak British hospital, a mother named Prichard has just given birth to a stillborn baby girl. Heartbroken, trembling, she asks the nurses one simple thing. Can she please dress her daughter in a beautiful christening gown for the funeral? Just that. One last act of love for a baby she never got to hold alive. But the doctors look at each other with something that isn't sadness. It's terror. They tell her no, firmly. No explanation. No apology. They wrap that infant so tight in thick, swaddling blankets that she looks like a porcelain doll, and they don't let Jean anywhere near her. She buries her daughter confused, devastated, and carrying a grief she can't fully name. And for the next 40 years, Jean Prichard will tell herself it was just hospital policy, just strict protocol. She had absolutely no idea that underneath those blankets, doctors had taken a bone saw to her baby girl and amputated both of her legs from the hip down. Her daughter's legs didn't go into that grave. They were packed into a biohazard container, loaded onto a transatlantic flight, and shipped to a nuclear research lab in Chicago, where they were incinerated into ash. This isn't some made-up internet ghost story. This isn't a crazy conspiracy theory. This is Project Sunshine, a 100% real, fully declassified, state-sponsored global body-snatching ring run by the United States government. And we're going all the way in. To understand how the US government turned into actual graveyard ghouls, you gotta feel the absolute panic that was happening behind closed doors in Washington, D.C. It's the early 1950s. The US and the Soviet Union are in a full nuclear arms race, detonating massive hydrogen bombs straight into the atmosphere on a regular basis. The public was told everything was fine. Duck and cover under your school desk. Smile for the cameras. But inside the government, scientists were losing their minds over something the public had no idea about. Every single nuclear blast was shooting millions of tons of a highly toxic radioactive isotope called Strontium-90 into the stratosphere. And here's where it gets deeply, quietly terrifying. Strontium-90 doesn't look dangerous. You can't see it, you can't smell it. And to the human body, to your bones specifically, Strontium-90 looks, acts, and processes exactly like calcium. So as the nuclear dust from those test blasts settled across the American Midwest, it rained down onto pastures. Cows ate the contaminated grass. The radiation bonded directly with their milk. And within weeks, everyday American children were sitting at the dinner table drinking glasses of radioactive milk, and nobody, not their parents, not their teachers, not their doctors, had the faintest clue. Once Strontium-90 got inside a growing body, it marched straight into the bone marrow, locked itself in permanently, and started mutating cells, triggering aggressive bone cancers and leukemia in completely innocent kids who'd never been anywhere near a test site. The Atomic Energy Commission was sweating bullets. They knew they were accidentally poisoning the global food supply, but they had a massive, terrifying data gap. They had zero idea how much radiation was already building up inside the bones of the actual population. They needed data, real human data, and that meant they needed human bones, hundreds of them. Now here's the thing about panicked governments with nuclear weapons, unlimited black budgets, and absolutely zero public oversight. When they decide they need something, they don't ask nicely, and they definitely don't stop to ask if it's legal. So here's where this goes from a scientific crisis to straight-up horror. If you actually want to know how fast radiation is building up in a human population, testing adult bones is basically useless. Their skeletons are already fully formed. You need the bones of newborns, infants, and toddlers. Why? Because a baby's body is growing at warp speed, aggressively pulling in calcium, and therefore aggressively absorbing Strontium-90 faster than anyone else on the planet. Their bones are basically the most sensitive radiation detectors in existence. But how does the United States government get its hands on hundreds of dead infant skeletons without triggering the biggest civil rights catastrophe in American history? They called a meeting. January 18th, 1955. Top secret, Washington, D.C. And thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, we now have the actual typed transcripts of exactly what was said in that room. Dr. Willard Libby, a brilliant Nobel Prize-winning chemist who helped build the atomic bomb and was one of the most respected scientists in the country, stood up in front of the military elite and said out loud, with his whole chest, "I don't know how to get them, but I do say that it is a matter of prime importance to get them, and particularly in the young age group. If anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country." A Nobel prize winner, telling the United States military to go out and become grave robbers. And not a single person in that room stood up and walked out. They nodded along like he just suggested a new filing system. The AEC then actually hired a major corporate law firm to figure out if they could pull this off legally. The lawyers told them straight up, "You do this out in the open, you will be sued into the ground, and half of this room goes to federal prison." So the AEC did what any totally normal government agency does when lawyers tell them something is illegal. They said, "Forget the law," and they went fully underground. What came next was one of the most organized criminal enterprises ever run by a government, except it had a budget, federal backing, and zero chance of prosecution. The AEC built a highly coordinated international tissue harvesting network from scratch. They recruited corrupt pathologists, rogue doctors, and complicit hospital administrators across America, Europe, Australia, and parts of South America. They divided the entire globe into clinical collection zones. The UK alone was designated as Area 5. The system worked like this. Whenever a mother suffered a stillbirth or a toddler died of natural causes inside a participating hospital, the trap got sprung. While those grieving families were weeping in waiting rooms, signing funeral paperwork and saying their goodbyes, the doctors in the back were acting like chop shop mechanics. They were sawing out femur bones, hip bones, ribs, and in some cases entire spinal columns from these deceased children. Not asking, not disclosing, not filing a single form, just taking. The stolen bones were packed into unmarked cardboard boxes and sealed aluminum canisters, slapped with commercial shipping labels so they'd clear customs without inspection, and flown directly to specialized research labs at the University of Chicago and Columbia University. And once those tiny bones arrived at the lab, the horror reached its final stage. Scientists would place these infants' limbs into ultra-high-temperature chemical crucibles and burn them completely to ash. That ash was then fed into radiation counters to measure exactly how much strontium-90 each child's body had absorbed before they died. Thousands of children across 26 countries, carved up, packed in boxes, and incinerated, all of it classified, all of it kept from every single parent who thought they buried their whole child. Here's where it gets even darker, because Project Sunshine wasn't just stealing from the dead. The government's obsession with radiation data was so far gone that they started running experiments on the living too. And they went after the most vulnerable people they could find. People who had no power, no voice, and no way to fight back. At the Walter E. Fernald State School in Massachusetts, which was essentially an institution for kids with intellectual disabilities, scientists from MIT and the AEC approached the boys with an offer that sounds wholesome as hell on the surface. They told these kids they were being invited to join a special science club. Members of the science club got extra breakfast. They got field trips. They got to feel special and chosen in a place where nobody ever made them feel that way. What the boys didn't know, what their parents were never told in any language that made it clear, was that their science club breakfast oatmeal was being laced with radioactive iron and calcium tracers. These children, some as young as 10 years old, who already had the hardest lives in that building, were being used as human radiation dosimeters. And here's the ice-cold logic behind it. The scientists needed to map out exactly how fast a living, growing human digestive tract absorbs radioactive material directly into the bloodstream. They couldn't get that data from dead bones alone. They needed a living body actively digesting, actively absorbing, actively moving radiation through its system in real time. So they picked the boys nobody would believe, the boys nobody was watching, the boys who would be excited just to get a hot breakfast. Scientists took their blood, monitored their urine, measured exactly how much radiation their growing bodies absorbed and how fast. When the truth came out decades later, the survivors talked about how excited they'd been to be picked for that club, how they'd bragged to the other kids. That detail alone, that these boys were proud of being experimented on because nobody had ever made them feel special before, is one of the most gut-wrenching things in this entire story. And that was just one program. The AEC was running dozens of variations of this across the country simultaneously. Pregnant women being given radioactive vitamin cocktails in free clinics. Hospital patients being secretly injected with plutonium. The dead babies were just the part they thought nobody would ever find out about. For nearly 4 decades, Project Sunshine was a ghost. Anyone who whispered about it got called a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist and dismissed. The government had buried it so deep that the families affected had no idea, the public had no idea, and even most government officials working in the 1980s had no idea it had ever happened. But in the early 1990s, an investigative journalist named Eileen Welsome started pulling on a thread. She found documents, then more documents, then names. Except they weren't really names, because the government hadn't logged these people as human beings. They'd stripped their identities entirely and cataloged them as cold alphanumeric codes, entries like CAL-1, HP-12, numbers in a spreadsheet that used to be someone's mother, someone's father, someone's child. Eileen Welsome was the first person in decades to cross-reference those codes back to actual living people, actual families, who had never been told what was done to their loved ones. Her reporting won a Pulitzer Prize, and it forced the issue into the open so hard that the Clinton administration literally had no choice. In 1994, President Clinton ordered a full federal review. The resulting advisory committee blew the doors off the entire operation, uncovering not just Project Sunshine, but a terrifying web of over 4,000 human radiation experiments conducted between 1944 and 1974. 4,000. And in 1995, Clinton had to stand in front of the nation and formally apologize on behalf of the United States government. When the declassified documents reached the public, they shattered families across 3 continents. Elderly mothers in the UK and Australia received government letters in the 1990s confirming that 40 years ago, while they were weeping in hospital corridors, doctors were in the back room taking bone saws to their dead children. The international backlash was brutal. Australia and the UK both launched formal legal inquiries. And the US government's official explanation, delivered after 40 years of silence, was essentially, it was wartime. The stakes were existential, and we needed the data to protect the living. Not a single scientist was charged. Not one doctor lost their license. Dr. Willard Libby, the Nobel Prize winner who stood in that room in 1955 and joked about body snatching for the country, had died in 1980 with his reputation completely intact. His Nobel Prize is still celebrated today. So, let's sit with Jean Prichard one more time. She wasn't a dissident, she wasn't a protester, she wasn't anyone who ever gave the government a reason to come for her. She was just a mom, in a regular hospital, on a regular street, trusting the doctors she was supposed to trust. And they looked her in the eye, wrapped her baby in those blankets, and lied to her face without blinking, for 40 years. The thing that hits different about Project Sunshine isn't even the scale of it, though the scale is genuinely insane. It's the ordinariness of the people it happened to. These weren't prisoners. These weren't enemies of the state. These were regular American and British and Australian families who did everything right and still got violated at their most vulnerable moment, the death of a child, by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. And here's the part that should keep you up tonight. The government didn't get caught because they grew a conscience. They didn't come forward voluntarily. It took a journalist 40 years later pulling on a single thread to force an entire federal investigation. Which means the question that really matters isn't what happened in 1957. The question is, what's happening right now, in 2026, that won't be declassified until 2066? Jean Prichard was just a regular mom in a regular hospital, trusting regular doctors, and they lied to her face for 40 years. So here's what I genuinely need you to answer in the comments. If this happened to someone that ordinary, in a hospital that normal, under a program that official, what's already happened to someone you know that won't be declassified until 2066? Drop your real answer below. I'm reading every single one. If this story made you feel something, hold on to that feeling, because that anger, that sick feeling in your stomach, that wide awake at midnight energy, that's what happens when somebody finally tells you the truth. If you want more of that truth, subscribe and stay in the vault. Follow the Ink Vault. We go where the others don't.